PR Connections Radio presents.
Welcome to Vegas Hockey Hub here on PRConnectionsRadio.com, the voice of new media. I'm host Ian Rachiele. And on this edition of Vegas Hockey Hub, we're going to be doing something a little bit different on this channel, as we normally focus on your Vegas Golden Knights and talk about everything that's going on involving the Vegas Golden Knights. But on this edition, we're going to pivot, and we're actually going to talk about the rest of the NHL, and actually we're going to do a kind of a different concept, and we're going to talk about the original 6 teams in the NHL. More importantly, how we're going to be breaking this down is what odds do an original 6 team have of winning a Stanley Cup next? All right, when it does happen, okay, inevitably when it does happen, it could be this season, it could be next season, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whenever it happens, we're going to be breaking it down like this, and where we're going to be kind of letting you know who has the worst odds of the original 6 to win a Stanley Cup next, who has, a top 5 odds of becoming a Stanley Cup champion out of the original 6, and then at the end, we will be giving you, in Vegas Hockey Hub's opinion, which original 6 team has the best odds of winning a Stanley Cup next. We're breaking down all of this here on Vegas Hockey Hub with your host, Ian Rachiele. Now, like I said before, we talk about the Vegas Golden Knights on this channel. That is the main discussion that we talk about, why it is our vocal point of Vegas Hockey Hub, talk about the Vegas Golden Knights. But I do want to mention that because we are talking about the original 6 teams, because we're talking about everything that's going on right now, we are going to be having a video about the Vegas Golden Knights organization. We're actually going to be talking about the latest of the Vegas Golden Knights coming up soon. So right after this episode, the next one is going to be about the Vegas Golden Knights. We're doing something a little bit different on this edition. Now, getting into the title of this video, which original 6 team will win a Stanley Cup next? So, how we're going to be breaking this down is that you have the original 6 teams. You have the Boston Bruins, Chicago Blackhawks, Detroit Red Wings, Montreal Canadiens, New York Rangers, and Toronto Maple Leafs. So, how we are going to be kind of doing this in terms of a structure is we are going to go from 6 to 1. Okay? We're going to go from the team that has arguably the worst chance of winning a Stanley Cup, and then we will go from the worst odds from 5, 4, 3, 2, and then the best odds at 1. And as we're breaking down all of this, we're going to be doing all of this and putting it onto our social media pages. So what I recommend is going to all our social media pages at Vegas Hockey Hub and checking out all the content and stuff we have on there. Now, getting into the title of this video, like I did mention, now, the worst odds to win a Stanley Cup from the original 6 teams. If you watch hockey, this should not be a surprise to you. The Chicago Blackhawks, they are not ready. They do not have a roster that is currently assembled. This is an organization that is still currently in a fresh rebuild. There is so much that needs to be done with the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, look, we get it. You got Connor Bedard. All right, you were lucky enough to get the number 1 overall pick a while back and select a generational talent in Connor Bedard. But how Connor Bedard performs, what it depends on is if the Chicago Blackhawks organization build around Connor Bedard. Because you have to remember, that top draft pick the Chicago Blackhawks have, 2024 NHL draft, he's not going to be ready for right away. Okay? He is not someone that's going to automatically make this team a Stanley Cup contender. The Chicago Blackhawks organization is so many years away. That's why they are 100 to 1 odds of winning a Stanley Cup. This is a Chicago Blackhawks organization that is not good enough yet to win a Stanley Cup. This is going to be an organization that when you actually break it down fundamentally, they really are about 4 or 5 years down the road. Okay? If we're saying by 2028, I would say the Chicago Blackhawks might have one of the best odds of winning a Stanley Cup from the original 6 teams. But just because you drafted Connor Bedard first overall, who indeed is a generational talent, and then you had that top pick, 2024 NHL draft, he could be a great player someday, but it's not enough yet. This is an organization that really is in an influx at this current point. When the Chicago Blackhawks eventually get it sorted out, where the Chicago Blackhawks eventually become a playoff contender, that will be great for the NHL. Anytime Chicago is among the top of the standings, normally it produces a lot of money for the NHL. The city of Chicago is such a passionate city, regardless if it was at the old days of Chicago Stadium or in the current days at the United Center. Just go back and look at their Stanley Cup run about a decade ago. The fans were insane. The fans were excited. And the people in Chicago held the Blackhawks to a higher standard. So the worst odds out of the original 6 teams to win a Stanley Cup is the Chicago Blackhawks. Because like I mentioned, and just like that comment put on there, this is a team that is so many years away. They are not ready at this point. I mean, just to give it more of an example, think about it. Seth Jones has one of the worst contracts in the NHL, and he is their top defenseman. He is supposed to be a quality defenseman for the Chicago Blackhawks. He unfortunately is not living up to the contract that they signed him to all those years back. But still, this organization only had 50 points on the year for this season. Okay? Now, this is also going to be the same Chicago Blackhawks organization that you're playing in the Central. They have Dallas, they have Colorado, you have Winnipeg, you have Minnesota. There's so many teams that are in the way of Chicago currently that it also provides a very big challenge to the Chicago Blackhawks. And like I mentioned, you have the teenager in Connor Bedard. Congratulations. I applaud you on that. Okay, you do have some young guys on the roster that could be a very good player down the road. But you also have a situation where you have a bunch of veterans on the roster too. I mean, the Chicago Blackhawks have a couple of guys on the roster right now who are in their 30s. They are currently towards the end of their career. So while you have a supporting staff, like, for example, you have Alex Vlasic, who is a good up-and-coming defenseman with the Chicago Blackhawks organization. You also have Lucas Reichel, who is a good up-and-coming, 22-year-old. There is a situation where Chicago Blackhawks, they are just not ready yet, and they are not going to be good enough to win a Stanley Cup anytime soon. So 10 years down the road, this will be a different odd. But right now, in 2024, the Chicago Blackhawks have the worst odds to win a Stanley Cup out of the original 6. 100-1 odds. The Chicago Blackhawks win a championship next out of the original 6. So, that was number 6 on the board, okay? Let's move over to number 5, okay? Number 5, when this team was a couple of years ago, they made it to the Stanley Cup final, they lose to Tampa Bay, and they have been on a nosedive ever since, despite having some young talent, despite having some players that could develop in their organization. This team, very similar to Chicago Blackhawks, they finished last when it came to the Atlantic Division, and more importantly, despite having a coach and an established player back in the day, a superstar in Martin St. Louis, they are not good enough to win a Stanley Cup next. And at number 5, I'm talking about the Montreal Canadiens out there in Quebec, 80-1 odds to win a Stanley Cup. I mean, this is an organization that was towards the bottom in almost every single category this past season. All right, this is an organization that you still have some remnants of when they went to the Stanley Cup a couple of years back, and then they added some young pieces on top of it. We know about Cole Caulfield, and Vegas Golden Knights fans, you know about their captain, Nick Suzuki, arguably the worst trade in Golden Knights history. Funny enough, we actually did a video on that. If you actually want to go and click on that, there's a couple of videos back. We talked about the worst trade in Golden Knights history and how Nick Suzuki going to Montreal really affected the Golden Knights negatively. But back to Montreal. When you study the roster and the makeup of the Montreal Canadiens, they do have a young goaltender in the wings in Caden Premu, but their goaltending, their main two goaltenders, are actually at the end of their 20s or the beginning of their 30s. Jake Allen being a good goaltender, but not great at this point in his career. And then when you also sit here and look at the Montreal Canadiens, it's a situation where you have all this young talent, but you also have young guys and old guys that are kind of competing with each other. I mean, you have Gould, who is a 22-year-old defenseman. You have Barron, who's also a 22-year-old defenseman. But then you also have some young guys on the forwards as well. They brought over Alex Newhook. They also brought over Kirby Dach from the Chicago Blackhawks when they wanted to get rid of him. The Montreal Canadiens have arguably one of the youngest rosters in the NHL. But when you also say that, you also have to acknowledge the older guys they have on the roster. You have guys like Sean Monahan, who was around there for this season with the Montreal Canadiens. You also had guys like Joel Armia, Josh Anderson. You even had some players like Brendan Gallagher, who's still around. This is a Montreal Canadiens organization who, once again, has older guys and younger guys on the same timeline and on the same roster, filling up the line combinations with the Montreal Canadiens. So, until they can kind of figure out a blend of the two, all right, until the Montreal Canadiens can assemble what the LA Kings did a couple of years back, where they kept 2 or 3 older players, but they also got rid of some of those older players and brought in an influx of younger guys. I say the Montreal Canadiens are about 2 or 3 years away. You still have a farm system that needs to be brought up to the NHL. There's still so many guys in Montreal who have not made an impact yet in the NHL. So, depending on the goaltending, because once again, after the whole Carey Price situation, the goaltending has kind of fallen apart in terms of dependability with the Montreal Canadiens. Defensively, their defense is young outside of Mike Matheson. They really do not have any old defensemen on that roster. Like I said, you have Harris, you have Barron, you have all these guys that are part of the young youth movement in Montreal. And then you have the forwards, and like I said, Caulfield and Suzuki are your main two. All right, that's been the established thing with Montreal. You have 2 guys who are under the age of 25 and have become a everyday core member in Montreal. So, at number 6, I had it 100-1 odds of winning a Stanley Cup very soon, is the Chicago Blackhawks. At number 5 is the Montreal Canadiens at 80-1 odds. And before anybody asks, for all the people out there in California, no, I'm not talking about the San Jose Sharks. I'm not talking about the LA Kings. I'm talking about the original 6 teams in the NHL. That's Boston, Detroit, New York, Toronto, Montreal, and Chicago. However, I appreciate all the people in California who watch Vegas Hockey Hub. Appreciate your support. Now, getting back into the Stanley Cup odds for the original 6 teams, getting into number 4. Now, this team is on the rise. This is a team that is towards the end of a rebuild. Okay, they tore it down. They brought back a Hall of Famer, a legend in the organization, and they became an everyday guy and has helped them turn around this roster. Of course, I'm talking about the Detroit Red Wings with 20-1 odds of winning a Stanley Cup next. Now, how I could see the Detroit Red Wings winning a Stanley Cup next is because they have finished a rebuild. They have a competent head coach. They have a GM. They have a president of hockey operations who cares about Detroit. You have someone, Steve Yzerman, who is a legend. Someone who has made the Detroit Red Wings organization become what it is now. And more importantly, this season, you finished with 91 points. This season, you barely missed the playoffs. No, seriously, you actually had a chance of making the playoffs, but due to the playoffs, due to the calculations, due to tiebreakers, you barely missed the playoffs. This organization has done it right. And as much as some people don't like to give Detroit credit, hey, trust me, I understand. Some people in Chicago, they hate the Red Wings. I understand that. I get it. However, the Detroit Red Wings organization has found a way to take their young guys and people like Lucas Raymond, to have some young guys like Moritz Seider and some guys like Michael Rasmussen. This is an organization that has taken the influx and a great farm system that was done by the Red Wings organization, and they've capitalized on it. It's also the same Detroit Red Wings that have a captain and someone who has scored over 30 goals in Dylan Larkin. This is an organization who swung for the fences and brought over a star in Alex DeBrincat, who played every single game for Detroit. It is somebody who has scored over 65 points in Detroit, and he has helped solidify the top six in Detroit. Now, when it comes to the 2024 NHL draft, Montreal Canadiens, their pick, they're still kind of left to be determined and see what happens there. Detroit, I actually look at them and go middle of the draft. I mean, that's essentially towards the middle of the first round. We'll see how many years it takes for that pick to eventually turn into the NHL and become an everyday guy. But in Detroit, I'm giving them 20-1 odds because you're this close. You've done your rebuild, you've done your research, and now you are a playoff caliber team. The question you have to ask yourself about the Detroit Red Wings is in net, in goaltending, do you have a solidified goaltender now? Because this is the last couple of seasons, Detroit Red Wings have had a rotation, a carousel of goaltenders coming in and out of Detroit. If they can find a solidified goaltender, Detroit can find a way to get a franchise goalie in between the pipes, then that is the one step away of making Detroit a legit contender in the NHL. So I give Detroit 20-1 because you had 91 points this season. I give Detroit 20-1 odds because when you finish a rebuild, it means that you have your core members, which they've established. You have built up your top six. You've built it. Your defense, you have brought in players. You've done it. Goaltending is really the only issue I do have with Detroit. You know, honestly, when it comes to Detroit Red Wings, I will tell you some other time about the Detroit Red Wings. In fact, all the logos in the NHL have an interesting history behind it. But when it comes to the Red Wings, there's actually a double meaning behind it. But I'll tell you all that later. Now, when it comes to Detroit, 20-1 odds, I like what they did this season. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how Detroit does this upcoming year. So heading into this season, Detroit Red Wings 20-1 odds, winning a Stanley Cup as an original six team. Now, the top three. This is the top three that have a legit chance. All right, this is three teams that have made it to the playoffs. Three teams who have done what they really need to do to win a championship. Now, two of these I think are right here, right now. Okay? The top two have a legit argument of coming out of the Eastern Conference and winning a Stanley Cup. The third one is for next year. But my, oh my, do I think next year they have a legit chance, okay? So top 2 this season. 3 is for next season. I'm putting this out there right here, right now. At number 3, 16-1 odds is the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, before everyone boos, before everyone clicks off, for anyone who's not from Toronto, let me explain why Toronto is 16-1. You have to remember that this is an organization who is in win now mode. The Toronto Maple Leafs want to win today, not tomorrow, today. Can they do it? Unfortunately, we have seen over the last while, they have not been able to do it. But they could do it this next season. This next season, depending on what happens with Mitch Marner, depending on what happens with William Nylander, depending on what happens with Morgan Riley. I mean, out of their core members, Austin Matthews is the only player I will say happily will be a Toronto Maple Leaf here, now, and forever. Okay, the Toronto Maple Leafs are going to have Austin Matthews be here no matter what. The remaining core is a huge question mark. The goaltending is a question mark. All right, you also had there in the playoffs with Ilya Samsonov. Hey, how'd that work out for you, by the way? The Toronto Maple Leafs are hoping that they can have a young goaltender who they've been developing in the minors and in their farm system become an everyday starter. Samsonov is not that guy long-term. Joseph Woll might be that guy long-term. So the one reason why they could do it is their core and their top 6 is among the best in all of hockey. That top 6 is the most electrifying, goal-scoring, lighting the lamp situation in Toronto. And if you can have the top 6 carry the team on their back, Toronto has a legit chance. The negative and the 2 reasons why Toronto won't get it done is the possibility of trading away their core members and not bringing them back moving forward. And the second reason is that the Toronto Maple Leafs have not been able to figure out the goaltending situation. It really seems like over the past while, the Toronto Maple Leafs have not sorted out the goaltending situation. They have really not had a great goaltender since Cujo, okay? I mean, Cujo is really the person I can think of as the last great goaltender the Toronto Maple Leafs have had. And before any hockey fans come into the comments, oh, what about Tuukka Rask? Tuukka Rask got traded to Boston for Andrew Raycroft. So technically, Tuukka Rask was drafted by Toronto, but he was not a Toronto Maple Leaf. All right, he was not someone who was great in Toronto. He became an all-time great in Boston and helped them win when it mattered the most. So when it came to Toronto, the goaltending's a problem, and the future of their core is a problem. Now at number 2, now this is going to be a hot take, okay? Because down to the final 2, if you're a fan of number 2, you're going to be mad I don't have a number 1. If you're a fan of the number 1 team, you might be surprised that I don't have you at number 2. Because at number 2, how I have all of this sorted out, I have the Boston Bruins as the second best odds of winning a Stanley Cup from an original 6 team. This is a Boston Bruins organization who has 12-1 odds of winning a Stanley Cup, and I will break down for you why this is. Let's start with the goaltending. The goaltending has been the highlight of the Boston Bruins. Over the past couple of years, the Boston Bruins, you had Linus Ullmark, you have Jeremy Swayman. All right, you have had arguably one of the best batteries in the NHL with Ullmark and with Swayman. So you have elite goaltending. The defense, led by Charlie McAvoy, has been elite. It's also the same Boston Bruins that Jim Montgomery took over for Bruce Cassidy, and they have had back-to-back excellent seasons in Boston. This season, the Boston Bruins have a legit chance of getting it done. The Boston Bruins this season could do what needs to be done and could win a championship. If we're basing it off of this season right here, right now, the Boston Bruins have a very good chance of doing what needs to be done. The one reason why they couldn't, my oh my, those Florida Panthers, huh? Oh my, those Florida Panthers, they might be a problem. You know, Florida, when it comes to Boston and the team I'm going to talk about next, could be an issue for you. Because this is a Florida Panthers team that wants to win. This is a Florida Panthers organization that, you know, Stanley Cup final. This is an organization that you look at Florida, and they've been there, okay? We know. We saw it. This is a Boston Bruins team that has not been to a Stanley Cup final since 2019. This is a Boston Bruins team that wants to win a Stanley Cup for the first time since 2011. So, when it comes to Boston, the only negative I have for them is Florida. Because Florida could be the bane to your entire existence. Seriously, Montreal and Toronto think they should win by heritage rather than on merit. Blackhawks will be in Stanley Cup before those two. That's a hot take. The Canadiens and Maple Leafs should be below the Blackhawks in terms of making a Stanley Cup final. I mean, considering the Canadiens and considering the Maple Leafs, Montreal Canadiens have made a Stanley Cup final in 2021. They got beat by Tampa Bay, but they did make it. The Toronto Maple Leafs have not made it in over 30 years as a Stanley Cup Finals appearance. So, if you want to use that argument for Toronto, I would give you that. But the Montreal Canadiens have actually made a Stanley Cup Finals appearance more recently than the Chicago Blackhawks have. The Blackhawks' final appearance was in 2015. Canadiens are in 2021. And by the way, the team I have with the best odds of winning a Stanley Cup from the original six, you see it on the board right here. The New York Rangers are the best team out of the original six. This is a New York Rangers team that is so talented from top to bottom that they have no argument of not being the best team from the original six. They have solid defense, Fox, Miller, all of those guys on the defense. Goaltending, Igor Shesterkin, top 3 goaltender in the NHL. The forward depth, you have Mika Zibanejad, you have Artemi Panarin, you have all of these incredible players on that top 6. The bottom 6 has been leveled out. If we're basing it off of this season right here, the New York Rangers have the best odds of winning a Stanley Cup from the original 6. If there's any team I would put money down on for winning a Stanley Cup this season, and if their original 6 team, the New York Rangers have the best opportunity to get it done. And I will make an argument to you right here, right now on Vegas Hockey Hub that I will not be surprised if by the end of the season at Madison Square Garden, MSG, one of the most iconic arenas in the world, the New York Rangers are hosting a Stanley Cup final. I will not be shocked. I will not be surprised. I will not be stunned if the New York Rangers are hosting a Stanley Cup final in New York, MSG, Manhattan. But anyway, this is my odds once again. At number 6, Chicago Blackhawks, 100-1. Number 5, Montreal Canadiens, 80-1. Number 4, Detroit Red Wings, 20-1. Number 3, Toronto Maple Leafs, 16-1. Number 2, Boston Bruins, 12-1. And then the best odds and the number 1 team out of the original 6, New York Rangers, 11-1. And this is Vegas Hockey Hub. I'm your host, Ian Rachiele. And until next time, continue watching hockey. Go support junior hockey. And good night, everyone.